All right, strap in, everybody, because today we are diving headfirst into the Magna Carta. You know, the one everyone's heard of, but nobody really seems to know that much about.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you really think about it. I mean, this one document signed in a field way back in 1215,
1215.
yeah, it still has an impact on how we think about rights today.
It's wild. So we should probably get right into it then.
It is pretty mind-blowing when you consider that this piece of parchment has actually influenced revolutions and laws around the world, even modern human rights laws. But we need to go back to 13th century England to get the full picture.
All right, so set the scene for us. What was going on back then?
Okay, so picture this. England, 13th century. He's got this young king, King John, who's just inherited the throne. And it's not exactly a pretty inheritance, let me tell you.
Oh, how so?
Well, it's constantly at war. I mean, constantly. Hemorrhaging land and resources faster than he can get them back.
So not exactly winning any popularity contests then.
No, not at all. In fact, to try and solve his constant money woes, he turned to relentlessly taxing everyone.
Everyone.
Well, especially the barons.
Now, these weren't just any old taxpayers, right?
Right.
Who were the barons exactly?
These were basically the medieval versions of CEOs, these powerful lords who controlled huge tracts of land and even their own armies.
Oh, I see. Okay. So they had a lot of power then.
Oh, yeah. And the thing is, the whole feudal system back then, it was a real balancing act. You see, the king, he needed the barons' loyalty and their armies, obviously. Yeah. And in return, the barons expected certain rights and privileges. That's how the system worked. So when John started demanding more and more without holding up his end of the bargain, well, it caused some issues.
So it sounds like John's, shall we say, relaxed tax policies weren't exactly a hit with the barons, but it sounds like there was more to it than just taxes, wasn't there?
Oh, yeah. John was, how should I put this? He was a bit of a pro at making enemies. He even managed to get on the Pope's bad side.
He picked a fight with the Pope.
Oh, he did. Tried to exert control over the church.
Wow. That's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Spoiler alert, it did not. The Pope at the time, Pope Innocent III, he was not having it. He excommunicated John, which basically meant that in the eyes of the church, he was a spiritual outcast. And if that wasn't bad enough, he then slapped England with an interdict.
An interdict? What's that?
Well, imagine you're living in a deeply religious country, and suddenly you're banned from doing any church services, no weddings, no funerals, nothing.
Oh, wow. I can see why that wouldn't go down so well.
It was chaos.
Talk about a PR nightmare, alienating everyone from the barons to the Pope. I'm guessing this all kind of came to a head at some point.
Oh, yeah, you could say that again. By 1215, the barons, well, they'd had enough. And remember, these guys were organized, they had real power, and they weren't afraid to use it.
So what do? Storm the castle? This was a full-blown rebellion, right?
Yeah. Oh, there were some pretty tense moments for sure, some standoffs and the like, but you've got to give John some credit here. He knew when he was beat, he realized that this wasn't just a few disgruntled peasants he could shut down. These guys, they meant business.
Okay, so what happens when a king can't win a fight? Asking for a friend.
He's forced to negotiate. And that, my friend, is where Runnymede comes in.
Runnymede?
Runnymede. It's this, well, it looks like a pretty normal field by the River Thames, nothing too special, but it was the setting for one of the most important events in English history.
Okay, now you've got my attention. What happened at Runnymede?
This is the good bit. The barons, they basically, and this is pretty modern when you think about it, they presented John with a list of demands, like a charter.
And what did this charter, this Magna Carta, say?
Well, it laid out all the limits to John's power they thought were, reasonable.
Okay, so did it just say, King John, be nicer?
It was a little more detailed than that. It had all these clauses about protecting people from being thrown in jail for no reason, which, let's face it, was a pretty common occurrence back then.
Right, so no more arbitrary imprisonment. Gotcha.
Exactly. Oh, and it also talked about due process of law. So, everyone gets a fair trial. And crucially, there were clauses about limiting the king's ability to just levy taxes whenever he felt like it.
So like what we'd call taxation without representation.
Oh, got it. That was huge. And it's actually where a lot of our modern ideas about government and rights come from, the idea that even the king is subject to the law. That was a big deal back then.
It still is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Though it's important to remember that back then, a lot of these rights only applied to the barons themselves.
Right. It wasn't for everyone. Okay, that makes sense. So John signs this Magna Carta, everyone shakes hands, and they all lived happily ever after. The end.
If only. John wasn't exactly known for keeping his promises. Almost as soon as he'd signed it, he went running to the Pope claiming, well, basically that he'd been forced into signing.
No way. He went back on his word.
Oh, he did, and get this. The Pope actually sided with him, declared the Magna Carta invalid.
Oh, that's not good. I bet the barons weren't too happy about that. So what happened next? Well, that's just asking for trouble, isn't it?
It was. Well, they escalated pretty quickly. England was plunged into the First Barons' War. It was a brutal time.
A messy medieval civil war. Okay, so what happened to the Magna Carta during all of this? Did everyone just forget about it?
It's funny you should say that because actually, no, they didn't. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. In the middle of all this chaos, King John, he dies.
Oh, okay, so what happens next? They just crown a new king.
Well, John's son, Henry III, he was only 9 years old at the time. But yeah, he took the throne.
9 years old, wow.
I know, right? So anyway, Henry's advisors, they knew they had to do something to stabilize the kingdom and put an end to the war. So they decided to reissue the Magna Carta, with a few tweaks here and there.
Smart move. Get some good PR going with the barons, right?
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because this reissued Magna Carta, it wasn't just a bargaining chip anymore. It actually became a cornerstone of English law.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It was reissued again and again over the next 100 years, each time becoming more important.
Okay, I have to ask, though, because this is what gets me. How did this 13th century document end up influencing the birth of America, like, centuries later? That blows my mind.
Well, it's all about the power of ideas, right? The things that were in the Magna Carta, things like no taxation without representation and protection from unlawful imprisonment, they really resonated with people, even hundreds of years, and an entire ocean away.
So are we saying that those colonists in America, when they started getting upset about unfair taxes, they were like, hang on a minute, we've read the Magna Carta?
Pretty much. The founding fathers, they looked back at the Magna Carta and saw it as this, really strong example of how to limit the power of the government and how to protect individual liberties.
That's amazing.
And it didn't stop there. These principles, they spread even further, influencing democratic movements and shaping human rights laws all around the world.
So, I mean, is the Magna Carta this perfect document from a simpler time then?
Well, it's important to remember that it definitely had its limitations. It was really only beneficial for the elite back then, and obviously some parts of it are totally outdated by today's standards.
Right. We're not living in the 13th century anymore.
Exactly. But, and this is the important part, those big ideas, those core principles, checks and balances, the rule of law, the idea that even a king has to follow the rules, those are ideas that are still important today.
They are.
The Magna Carta reminds us that rights aren't just given to us. They're fought for and they evolve and they need to be protected if we want to keep them.
It's really incredible to think about, isn't it? This document from over 800 years ago that was literally signed in a field, it still has things to teach us today.
It really does.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one.